Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very excited to spend the next 45 minutes or an hour with you all. I'm Lou Pelosi, and I'm the moderator for this afternoon's session on radical innovation and audacious entrepreneurial thinking. I'm very happy to be joining you. I'd like to just first thank the folks that made this possible, and that's obviously Tufts University and the Tufts Entrepreneurship Center. And I'm also affiliated and part of the Tufts Entrepreneurship Network, and they're really the folks that are helping today. There's a few folks behind the scenes too that are working with us to make this all possible. I'd just like to extend a thank you to all of them to make this possible too. Just in the way of the background of myself, again, Lou Pelosi, I'm the Vice President of Business Development and Partnerships for On24, a San Francisco-based venture-funded marketing software company. But more importantly for today, I'm a Tufts Entrepreneurship Center Board of Advisor and a long-term Tufts University alumni engaged in the community. And we're fortunate enough to have panelists here today that fall under that same umbrella. Just in the way of my experience, I was a Tufts University BS in mechanical engineering many years ago. I found myself out here on the West Coast at business school and have pretty much made my career in Silicon Valley over the last 25 plus years. I've been fortunate to ride the wave really of two big innovation activities out here, and that was broadband and bringing broadband information into homes and businesses, and also software as a service enabled by broadband, the ability to have software out on the internet or in the cloud as opposed to installing it on servers in your offices. I've been, again, blessed. I've been part of an IPO out here in Silicon Valley. I've been with companies, 3 of them that have been bought. I've also had the colossal failure of a company that couldn't raise its Series B and had to shut down. But today really isn't about my experience or my history. It's really about our panelists. And we are very, very fortunate today to have 2 panelists that have seen a broad spectrum of innovation, radical innovation, entrepreneurial thinking, and have been parts of organizations that have really moved the needle in some of the most exciting areas today. So I am going to first introduce Julie Schoenfeld. Julie is a serial entrepreneur. She is a CEO. She's a founder. She's a board member. And currently she's an entrepreneur in residence at Caltech. And we're very excited to have you as part of this. Julie, why don't I turn it over to you for a little bit more detail. Tell us a little about your journey from Tufts University to where you sit today.
Sure, thanks Lou. And it's great to meet a fellow mechanical engineer from Tufts. I graduated in '79 with a BSME. And when I went to Tufts, I had always known I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I thought by going to engineering school, I would learn something about the basic technologies so that I could form companies around those technologies. What I didn't consider was that engineering school gave me a very different foundation, and that foundation was the ability to solve problems. I remember sitting in the library of engineering, Anderson Hall at the time, just with problem sets, one after another, and I didn't know that I was actually training to become an entrepreneur. So that it was a great education for many reasons, not the least of which was the technical education, but the problem solving skills is really what I got. So from when I graduated from Tufts, I joined Procter & Gamble's manufacturing management program, where I really learned how to make things and how to manage people who make things. And from there, I decided that I'd wanted to go back in and get my MBA. I went to Harvard. And when I was at Harvard, I knew that I wanted to run my own business. So I looked around and I said, okay, what is the job everybody wants in order to be able to be ready to do their own startup? And at the time, the job was to become a product manager at Hewlett Packard. Now, in those days, Hewlett Packard was the job to get. Nowadays, it's Google. So, and Google and Facebook. And so I got that job, spent the time earning my stripes at Hewlett Packard, launched a number of products, saw some radical innovation and how network computing was going on and network management was going on. And then from there, I took a number of jobs with different companies, both small and large. And what I wound up doing was really playing every position. I was in charge of sales, I was in charge of marketing, I was in charge of operations, and what it gave me was a bit of a foundation. But it wasn't until I was 15 years into my career that I actually started running businesses, which is kind of late, to be perfectly honest. But I did start my first business in 1997. It was a chat product for on the web. And it was the 1.0 go years of the internet. And we got off the ground, and within 18 months, my company went from zero to being acquired for over 300 million by Ask Jeeves, which was a search engine at the time. And they're speaking of radical innovation. When all the tools for the internet came out, there was a radical innovation shift. And it was interesting to be there at the beginning. Nobody really knew that search engines were going to rule the world. And it really wasn't until Google came up with a better product and a better value proposition, which was, we're going to organize the world's data. They weren't just a search engine. They had a bigger vision. And that's one of the lessons on radical innovation. Anyway, from there, after selling that business to Ask, I went on, created an optical components business called OEWaves, and it spun out of Caltech, and it's located in Pasadena. Then I did a company called Perfect Market, which was trying to help traditional publishers like the LA Times and the Tribune Corporation make more money online. So that was an ad tech play, another radical innovation. That company was acquired by Taboola, which is a company many of you may know of today. And then after that, I started a business called Strobe, which created LiDAR, which is a sensor that goes on a self-driving car. That company, Strobe, was acquired by Cruise General Motors in 2017. And when I left Cruise last summer, I then stepped in to become the entrepreneur in residence at Caltech and work with some of the greatest innovators on the planet to help them bring their products to market. So.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Julie. Thanks for that great introduction, great breadth of experience that we'll be able to share with the audience as we get into our moderated Q&A session. Without further ado, our second panelist today is David Jenn. David is with X, the Moonshot Factory. Some people know them by their formal name, Google X. Another tremendous journey since Tufts University. Welcome, David. Provide a little bit of background and how you find yourself here in Silicon Valley today and your journey from Tufts.
Sure. Thanks, Lou, for organizing this. I think this is going to be super fun, and I'm happy to be here. So a quick introduction of myself. Like Lou said, I'm David, and I'm here mainly because I lucked out into a super interesting job, right? I say this because I get to work at a moonshot factory called X. Also, like Lou said, some of you might know us by our previous name. We used to be called Google X. But despite the name change, we still have the same mission. Our goal is to develop and apply radical technologies and use them to solve big problems. And by big problems, we're generally looking at global scale problems. So you might have heard of Alphabet's big bets in self-driving cars, internet balloons, autonomous drone delivery, and contact lenses that can monitor diabetes. Those all at one point kind of sounded like science fiction, but now they're all real companies at Alphabet. And they all started at X. So despite how cool the projects sound, and I'm happy to talk about all the projects, the real meta mission of X, the real thing that we're really working on, is we're trying to make innovation reproducible. That's actually why we call ourselves a factory. Our new name is X, the Moonshot Factory. So at X, we're trying to lay the infrastructure and we're trying to build a culture that allows us to repeatedly generate innovations that have impact on the world. In essence, we're trying to bottle the aha moment that a lot of entrepreneurs get kind of outside of Alphabet. This is actually where I spend a ton of my time. And that's why I'm really glad to be here today, because I think innovation is such an important thing to talk about. whether you're at Google or outside in starting your own company, or even in any other big company. So at X, I have two jobs, one paycheck. So I lead our finance team, and I also lead our investments team. So what this means is, number one, first and foremost, I work with our CEO every day. I help him to analyze, green light, and fund projects. The other thing I do is I run operational finance. And a big part of that job is I spend my time recruiting, training, and mentoring the future CFOs for our portfolio company. So X has been around for about 10 years, and I've been lucky to be there for about 7. And in that time, I've learned a ton, I think, about what it's like to work and create innovative companies. We always say we work on things that are kind of on the edge of impossible. It took a real mental shift, though, for me to really find my groove at X. When I first got to X, it just seemed like a really weird place, and that's in part because it is actually a really weird place. But it was doubly true for someone like me who came from a finance background. So if you read my bio, you'd see that I came from a pretty traditional background. So after Tufts, I worked at JP Morgan. I worked at a big 5 consulting company. I went to business school. And in my time in my career, I feel like I definitely developed a theory for how to be successful at work. I think a lot of you guys on the call might have this. It's like a little hack that you develop so you can be on autopilot, right? For me, that was, you work really hard, right? You pull your all-nighters at the investment bank. You manage risk, which basically means you can't ever really fail. And it leads to good things. You get promoted or you land that next big job that you want. These frameworks that I picked up, they totally failed me when I got to X. They really just didn't work inside of a moonshot factory. So since then, I've become a big proponent to something that we call moonshot thinking. And the idea is, if you want to build 10x businesses, and by that I mean businesses that are aiming to make things 10 times better, you need to really embrace a culture that has the guts and the audacity to try and reach for big things. So at X, we have actually a really simple process. We believe that you start at the hardest part of the problem, you run small experiments, you engage with the real world as fast as possible. But the hard part about our process is you have to be totally okay with failing, because we know that we learn from our mistakes. And when you actually find something that works, when you're going after a really, really big problem, the outcomes could be really, really outsized. They could be huge. So Lou, I could talk about this honestly forever. I'm really glad to be here. And instead of rambling on for a long time, I'm just going to turn it back to you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks very much for the background, Julie and David. And let's just jump back. Let's jump into the main matter today, and that's radical innovation. We are not talking about innovation where you're trying to get 10% more market share or 5% more mind share. We're talking about big, huge quantum leaps in the marketplace. And I think for everyone today, I'd love, David, to maybe direct it to you first on what's your definition of radical innovation, and perhaps maybe you can share how you think about it from a process and what X thinks about when they think about radical innovation.
Yeah, that's a great question, right, Lou? So we don't really necessarily have a focus area like a lot of VCs would. So our goal is to create breakthrough technologies and use them to solve big problems, right? We want to impact billions of people in a positive way. Our other goal is to build large, sustainable businesses. That's what we're here to do. What we tend to look for is the intersection of 3 things. So number 1, we want to make sure we're going after a huge problem. Number 2, we want to make sure we can take a different perspective on that problem and come up with a radical solution. And number 3, because we're a tech company, we want to use a breakthrough technology that we can develop or at least convene to get the job done. That's why we actually don't work on technology for the sake of technology, right? We don't like interesting ideas that don't have a real world application. We're looking to kind of solve big problems and build big companies. An example of something that we're working on right now that I feel like hits all of these categories that I'm really excited about is we have an agricultural moonshot right now. The big problem, right, is that humanity will very soon be 10 billion people. And it's going to be increasingly hard to feed 10 billion people in a productive and sustainable way. The radical solution that we're going after is something that we call computational agriculture. So kind of the aha moment we came up with is the tools that farmers are using today. They're really offshoots and like improvements on top of industrial era tools. And we think we can make that better. The radical technology, the breakthrough technology we're using is we're trying to convene breakthroughs in machine learning, sensors, robots, because we love robots, satellites, to help farmers make better and healthier decisions about their crops. And a cool example of something that we're doing here is that we created these prototype plant buggies. We can call them a robot if you want. They right now roll up and down giant fields, hectares and hectares of farmland somewhere in North America. And they're taking pictures and collecting data on every plant in that field. And the reason why we're doing that is we're trying to design a system where we can help farmers make better and smarter decisions about the crops in their field. So for example, if a plant has a bug problem, you don't need to spray the whole field with pesticides, right? You could just go after and intervene in that one plant. And this is like a really great example of something that we're working because it hits on all three of those areas.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Julie, anything to add from your perspective? What's radical innovation? You know, when you see it, how do you know it? And how do you determine what areas you want to get involved in?
Right. So Lou, when you asked me to be on this panel, the first thing I did was I looked up what's the definition of radical innovation. And what I discovered is there really is no real definition. Everybody has a slightly different take on it. But what I think my best view of what radical innovation is that anything that's introduced into the marketplace that disrupts the way it was being done before, to the point where whatever was being done before isn't done that way anymore. And I think it lives on a continuum. I think, you know, if you think back to railroads being supplanted by other transportation forms, as if the railroads thought themselves as a transportation industry, they might have been able to radically innovate along the way and become a different kind of company. Just like Google didn't see themselves as a search engine business, they saw themselves as organizing the world's data. So it's something that would change the industry in total. And so, you know, I was thinking about Uber as an example, as a company that changed the way people transport around the world. And there really wasn't that much innovation in the technology itself. It utilized new technologies that had come online, like GPS and the ability to use the cell phone to be able to call a car, so you displace the dispatcher. But it was the combination of all these technologies that had emerged on top of having a very compelling entrepreneur who was willing to fight all the legal barriers. So I consider Uber as having been a radical innovation without it having, you know, without it being what you think of as typically technical in nature. But as I'm at Caltech, I see things that would probably fall more carefully into a radical innovation framework. There's an awful lot of biological work going on at Caltech. There's a lot going on with genomics and synthetic biology in changing the way our healthcare system and our medical treatments will work in the future. So I consider those enormous radical innovations. But what I'd like to say, since I'm an entrepreneur and I come at this from, okay, in order to introduce something enormous to the world, like computational agriculture, that takes the deep pockets of a company like Google. What can an entrepreneur do in that? And the beauty of radical innovation is that it's the rising tide raises all boats. So David mentioned sensors. Well, you know, there is a couple of drone activities going on at Caltech that will potentially help precision agriculture in ways that were not useful before. So small companies can hang around at the rim and watch what companies like Google are doing, and then bring smaller innovations that add to the total piece of the pie. Much like what I did with my LiDAR company being acquired by Cruise General Motors. It was a sensor that's important for the self-driving car. It wasn't the complete system, but it was a piece of the radical innovation.
And Julie, employees, tell me a little bit about what company employee traits are important to be able to develop or promote or foster so that you can have a mindset of doing something big.
Right. So I'm dying to hear David's answer on this one, but it's definitely the mindset of optimism. You know, you have, so there's two things. One is being on the team and it's leading the team. So what I will say is you have to have a compelling leader in order to drive radical innovation. Generally, it takes a long time. These bets are not a 2-year bet. These are, you're in it for the long haul. And a leader needs to keep the team engaged and motivated and keeping going. So you have to have a leader who has the ability not only to sell their ideas to the market, but also to the employees. So it's somebody whose passion and drive and persistence will keep everybody engaged. You also have to have the ability to see the future. And, you know, we talk about, okay, here's a problem that we're going to solve. What is the likely way this is going to get solved? And being able to see it into the future and seeing the near-term milestones, that's a real skill that you need to have. You also have to have unrelenting tenacity. I'd say if I have one skill that has helped me through not only engineering school, but all through my career, it's just I will not give up. And I think that anybody who's been part of a radical innovation knows what I'm talking about, is you see many things, you know, 1,000 ways that don't work until you get to the successful way. And tenacity is really one of the #1 qualities that I see as critical for the mindset. As an entrepreneur, you know, we're used to risk. You know, if you actually, I'm thinking about David, when you were an investment banker, you managed risk very carefully. Finally, after my 3rd startup, I started looking at, you know, the statistics of what it takes to have a successful startup. And I was just thinking, I do not manage risk at all. I'm way too optimistic, way too driven, and way too tenacious. If I were actually rational, I probably would have done something different in my career.
And maybe on that, David, love to hear your thoughts, company characteristics, employee characteristics. And I just want to let everyone know that's participating in the audience. There is a Q&A button. We've already gotten a number of questions, and we'll start feathering in those questions, and hopefully we have the opportunity to address them all. But David, back to you, a little bit about the traits.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking, Julie, to your answer, I agree with everything you say, and I wouldn't say you didn't manage risk. I would say that you took a one-on-one bet on yourself, and I think that's the right thing for an entrepreneur to do. The thing that I would add to that, which is not very much, is I think that the most important trait that I search for when I'm hiring a leader at X, or even kind of like a right out of grad school type person, is I look for someone who is brave, right? Like I was just joking with a panelist earlier today about my son. My son is turning 3 at the end of the year. And he might actually be like the perfect entrepreneur because he's constantly running these like little experiments, whether it's like sticking his hand in something or jumping off something. And he's not been trained like the rest of us that failing is bad. He's not afraid of that yet. He might cry for a bit and sometimes for a lot longer than a bit, but he moves on really quickly and he'll just try something again, right? So at X, what we try to do is we try to bring this childlike spirit to our day-to-day because we're really trying to build a place that's great for entrepreneurship, right? So what we want to do is we want to dream like little kids, and we want to make sure we test and we look at things like adults and as scientists, right? And I think, Julie, that goes to a lot of what you were saying earlier. So that's why we go after the hardest part of the problem. We come up with like a ton of theories for what can solve the problem. We develop a lot of small little experiments to test out our theory because even though, as you say, Julie, we have deep pockets, you know, we have big ambitions too. We want to go after a lot of things and we can't waste our time. That's like the most important part, right? So if we fail, we just move on. We learn and we hope we don't make the same mistake again. But if we like don't fail, then we just move on to that next set of experiments and we run it again, maybe with a little bit more money, a little bit more time, and see how that goes. And what I would say about X is, you know, some companies say they're okay with failure. X really takes us to another level. I still remember it was like the weirdest thing. When I first got to X like 7 years ago, the CEO at the time, it wasn't Astro, it was a different guy. He asked me to give a spot bonus to someone who shut down their own project. Another way of putting exactly what I just said is somebody failed at their job and then we paid that person a spot bonus, right? That goes like totally contrary to the way that a lot of Silicon Valley is geared, right? If you go to Andreessen Horowitz, Excel, like any of these big venture capital companies here in the Bay Area, you only see posters for the winners, like Uber, like Lyft, like Google, you know, Microsoft, whatever. But at X, you might actually see a poster for something we shut down. And the way the reason why we're okay with that is because we know that the people working on the project, they're gonna know the most about that. Like they're like Julie, they're taking that one-to-one bet, right? And we don't want them to waste their time or their energy or my money on this. And you know, it's very easy for us to sleepwalk off a cliff and invest like millions of dollars into something before we realize that we can't do it. So that's why we want to build a place where people can be brave. They can step up and just say like, look, this is not going to work out, and I'm going to move on to something else. And that's why I think in addition to being tenacious, you have to like dispassionately assess what is and isn't possible, and like not fall in love with a solution you have necessarily, but really just find the next thing that might solve that problem.
You know, this obviously topic about characteristics of the company and people has hit a nerve because we've had 7 or 8 questions that came in already, and I think you've addressed a couple of them. Stephen specifically asks, you know, how do you as a company, you know, try to build this culture that failure doesn't matter? What happens when the project isn't going the right way? It can't get funding, and do the people feel like a failure? You know, the people that are involved, right? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, like, I think that if I were to say it is, at X, like, we celebrate the failure. We celebrate it as much as we celebrate the success, right? For us, it's all about the process. And the way I look at it is nobody wants to spend their time working on something they know is not going to work. And that happens a lot, right? Like you know, we have this weird story at X. It's called the Monkey and Pedestal. It's really weird. I'll get into it in a second, but like basically, like so the story goes, someone's manager goes up to an engineer and says, hey, I want you to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal, right? At most companies, what people will do is they will start building the pedestal, because that's the easy thing to do. Like when your manager stops by, you can say, hey, I'm 10% done today. And you know, next time he stops by, you can say, I'm 30% done, give me a promotion, right? But the real hard thing is like training the monkey to recite Shakespeare. And you know, a quick Google search would tell you that that's impossible, right? You should move on, you should work on something else. And we celebrate success, we celebrate failure, and we celebrate success, but we celebrate failure because it frees up your time. You know, we hire like the best and the brightest, like a lot of people on this call, the smartest people in the room. And, you know, most of the time they're going to move on and find much more interesting things, or we'll find them much more interesting things because the process is actually what we care about.
And maybe to Julia, a question to you that came in from Alex. What's the most important skill to develop as a young professional to become a leader in an innovative company like you have?
So I would build on the topic that David just hit on, which is failure, which is you got to teach yourself how to fail. And the way I learned how to fail was sort of like, I mentioned early on that I was playing every position in bigger companies before I actually started doing startups. And at one point in my career, I went from being the VP of marketing for a publicly traded company to being, it's a long story how it happened, but I wound up being a sales rep, a bag carrying sales rep for a software company. And the job of a sales rep is that you look at the wall and you run at the wall as hard as you can, and 3 times you bang into the wall, and one time, the 4th time, the door opens. And that's what the sales job is all about. But what I learned from that is that if you can sell a product, you can sell anything. And when you're an entrepreneur, when you're doing innovation, when you're managing a team, the skill you need is to be able to sell. And raising venture capital, they're not buying the company, they're buying you. So I would encourage any young person who's trying to figure out where they're going to go, and I'm assuming everybody's a Tufts graduate and has a wonderful educational background and terrific technical chops, which you will learn along the way, but this is the one that nobody talks about. When you're in a technical company, I was in this particular database company where I was selling, the engineers called us the sales slime. That's how they felt about salespeople. But if I look back and I think about why was I able to have 3 exits when some of my competitors weren't even close? Why was I able to raise so much money from venture capitalists? Why was I able to scale my companies? It's because of the skills I learned by selling.
Excellent, excellent. And David, maybe a question for you. We talk a lot about broad ideas and radical innovation to get into new marketplaces. Brandon asks, can you discuss the role, limitations, and constraints that play in developing innovation? I guess, how do you bound it? How do you know maybe what might be too big of an idea, or how do you think about constraints?
Yeah, we typically try not to think about the constraints, right? Like if you think about the X process, our ideas, they can kind of come from everywhere, but a lot of times they start with this team that we call the rapid evaluation team. So their job is to come up with like 1,000 new projects every year. And their other job is to shut down all 1,000 of their projects, right? They're really kind of trying to figure out what's possible and what's not possible. So what I would say is, instead of thinking first about the constraint, what we do is to Julie's point earlier, we'll think about what is the huge problem, right? Like self-driving cars 10 years ago, that's an area that we really innovated. And the big problem was that a lot of people were dying in car accidents. Now, the 10% solution, Lou, that you were talking about, that might be developing a better seatbelt, better airbag, because they had constraints, right? They're like, okay, there's a car that's already built and someone's already driving it. How do I make it so that it's safer for those people to drive it? But if you remove the constraint, right, and you go, what's the real heart of that problem? What's the hardest part? The hardest part is that people are bad drivers, right? I'm a bad driver. I think there's some of my friends who are on this call that know I'm a bad driver. And so long as there's going to be a human in that equation, we're never going to get to that 10x solution. So how do we take that person out of the equation and get to something that's 10 times better, right? That happened to coincide with huge breakthroughs in LiDAR technology, in machine vision, in on-prem computing, edge computing, et cetera. But the real thing that we did is we said, what's the big problem? And then we went after different solutions for how do we remove that person, right? We started without any constraints.
Great, fantastic. I think I'm going to roll more with the audience questions. They're giving us their time and energy. I'm going to try to see if we can go through a few of those and then feather in some of the other topics that had come up. Maybe Julie, to you, Pamela writes, when founders leave a company, what changes?
So it's the founder, again, it depends on the founder. The founder is generally the person that provides the engine, to really drive things forward. And so a lot of times the entrepreneurial juice goes away. Now, in some companies, when the founder leaves, it's time for scaling to occur. And many people who have that creative juice don't have the patience or the wherewithal to do the hard, for some people, the hard part of scaling. So it's very dependent upon the type of founder. But think about it in terms of someone like Elon Musk. Elon Musk has become synonymous with Tesla. He's become synonymous with SpaceX. He's become synonymous with radical breakthroughs, and people have come to trust his vision. And if he walked away, I do think that those companies would suffer, and that the employees wouldn't be able to see the vision as clearly. You look at a company like Uber, where the founder left, and I think the jury's out. Had he taken it far enough that somebody who was much more operationally skilled, like the current CEO, can then take it the rest of the way. I think the best case scenario is an example like Google, where the two founders stayed with the company for quite a long time, got it to the point where it is a juggernaut in terms of innovation, technology, ability to do all kinds of things in the world. So it's kind of a rambling answer. Hopefully I hit on the points you wanted to hear.
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Julie. David, there's some questions that are coming in about how do you pace the company? Are you going too fast? Are you going too slow? Let me kind of paraphrase a few of them, but how do you know when you've made it to a minimal viable product? How do you know when it's time to kind of hit the go button versus we have to do more research? What's going into those thoughts as the segments and the opportunities and the risks are so big?
Yeah, it's a good question. We talk a lot about the MVP, the minimum viable product. I think different people will have different interpretations of this, but my personal view is that there really isn't any such thing as an MVP, right? Like you're going to get out there, you're going to test, and you're going to quickly learn that whatever you built and you thought was the right thing is probably not the right thing. And because of this, I really do think that the two most important parts of building a product that's innovative is, number one, again, going after the heart of the problem, right? That is like, go after the monkey, don't build that pedestal, right? Number two, it's get out there, just see what it's like. It doesn't matter if what you have looks kind of janky. Like, let's just see how people interact and touch and react with it, right? Like I said, at X, we have that monkey and the pedestal story, but we believe that once you identify the monkey, the big technical hurdle or the big operational hurdle, spend all your time going after that. Don't go after side things, like the thing you built doesn't have to look perfect or whatever. Go after that. And if you feel like you've gotten over that hurdle even a little bit, the step two in the journey is just get out there, right? Like, see what it's like in the real world. We have like a story of something we've been dealing with at X that has to do with real monkeys. So we have a project that's designed to bring internet to the 5 billion people on the planet that aren't blessed to have high-speed internet. And the technology that we're using is called free space optics. Think about it as like a laser beam of light that goes from one terminal to another terminal that beams super high-speed internet without the need of a wire. So we got the technology to work. We overcame what we thought was the monkey. And we started testing in India with a partner. And we really quickly came to realize that we had to put them up on these super high power poles. And there are these monkeys that called the poles home. And apparently they were super territorial. And they kept on like breaking our devices or very much threatening the people putting up, the poor engineers putting up the terminal. So we had to engineer our way around that, right? Like, now that's a funny story, but like the reality of it is that like, that was something we could never have figured out if we just stayed in the lab, right? If we just stayed in the office, we needed to get out there, and we figured out kind of a cooler engineering way to solve that.
Yeah, and it's really great when you bring up examples of the projects you're working in or on or had worked on. You've got this minimal viable product. You've decided that you've met the opportunity is there to go ahead and launch. And then you have this whole issue of scale and how to invest in scale, how to think about scale. Maybe Julie, you've been a part of a number of successful organizations that, you know, sometimes you think you've got the breakthrough technology and that's all it takes. Can you touch base a little bit about thinking about scale?
Well, so the good thing about all these questions, they're all kind of dovetailing together, and to building on what David says, you're not ready to scale until somebody really wants it and you know that they want this product, or whatever the intended use is really how it's going to work. And when I started out at Hewlett Packard, the way we would figure out the minimum viable product was we would go to pretty much the next bench and ask the engineers, what does this product need to be for you? And so at that time, we never really learned the lesson that you need to get out, put it out there in the marketplace, put it in front of the intended user, give it some time in the marketplace. So I am a big proponent of getting it in front of people as fast as possible. So that's sort of just reiterating what David was saying. And you know, scaling. Having just spent some time at General Motors, who are, you know, arguably one of the greatest manufacturing entities in the world, they have making cars cheaply down to a science. They have the volume, they have the processes, they have the procedures. And the issue is, how do you get from A to B? How do you cross that chasm for when you get the innovation ready, so then now you can throw it over the bench and have it become manufacturable? You don't really want to go there until you've made that monkey recite Shakespeare. And I think I would just want to reiterate David's point again and again.
Super. David, any thoughts about scale in some of the ventures you're involved in? That the scale is phenomenal just to think about, but how do you go from the start to where you want to be?
Yeah, I would just add on to what Julie said earlier. You know, like, I think that one of the great things that we can do at X that might be different than other places is that we can separate innovation and scale a little bit, because I think there needs to be some space, right? Like, to really think differently. If you really think back to the history of Google, our founders have always been really interested in innovation, right? So, you know, Act 1 of innovation at Google was what we call 20% time. That's like become pretty famous in Silicon Valley, where every engineer could spend a day of the week, about 20% of his or her time, working on something outside of core, outside of the scale part of their job. If I really think about it, Google X is really kind of step 2 of that innovation journey, where we started creating actual physical distance, right? Now we had a group of people who are designed to really think about innovation really deeply. And now that we're Alphabet, right, we're now a family of companies. So if you think about it, we've created legal entity separation, right? The great thing about all this for me is that people who are really good at the innovation part can focus on the innovation part. And then we can hire some of the best people in the world in supply chain and in sales and sales, et cetera, to take the project on to their next level. So we really believe that, like, it's really important for us to find the right group of people, and they might not even be at X, right? Like, or at Google even, or at Alphabet, right? To take the project on to do the thing that it's meant to do.
Excellent. Thanks, David. There's another question here. I think, Julie, I'll address it to you because it's something that we touched base on prior to the call when we had our introductory meeting, and it's it's this idea of how do you know if you failed or if it's just a bump in the road? And it got me thinking about our conversation about your careers are long, and sometimes things happen that you don't expect, and a failure doesn't look like that over time. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, as an entrepreneur, I think it's a lot easier to know when you failed because, your resources are very constrained and they're very finite. And so running out of money is one of the surest sign of failure. But, and I was just sitting here listening to David misty-eyed over people celebrating when you failed, because I can tell you that venture capitalists do not treat you like that when you do fail. So, yes, failure when your resources are limited is a lot more devastating to you and your team than when you are at a large company. That said, when you hit a failure, I have never myself personally experienced a failure that didn't bring me to a greater place. And when I first did my first startup back in the first internet days, I had already 15, 20 years of business experience under my belt, and I was looking at these young whippersnappers coming along who just graduated from school, and I thought, how are they so articulate? How do they know so much? It took me this many years to get to that level. And then we hit that first internet .bomb crash. And that's when I learned what failure is really about, is that I had experienced so many different things. I had so many tools in my toolbox. And I hit a point after the crash of one market that I just couldn't raise any more money. So I figured out how to raise money using government grants. And so I wound up funding a company for many, many years and still building my technology by utilizing SBIRs. These are government small business innovation research grants. And I discovered that the odds of raising money from an SBIR were like 25%. If 100 people apply, 25 might get it. Whereas with a VC, it's about 1 in 100. So every failure delivers a new lesson, and those lessons eventually come together and allow you to be even better in the long run.
Super, thank you. A couple of other questions that are coming in. This one, kind of a specific question, but Stacia writes, do either of you see any benefits or pitfalls for social entrepreneurs to bridge tech companies and public-private entities as a SaaS provider? That might be, David, I don't know how much social entrepreneurship, your thoughts. I know a lot of what X does often thinks about social addressing social problems. Let me just kind of see if you have something for that.
Yeah, I don't know I fully understand the question, but we believe in profit and purpose, right? Like we want to make sure that on the one hand, we're working on something that can really positively impact a lot of people, right? And we believe that if we do that, like we should be able to find a way to turn it into a sustainable business. I wouldn't separate those two things too much. Like I believe there's a purely social company, right? But like I really do believe that if you want to really create like big time change, like global scale change, even country level change, like my personal view of it is that you need to make sure that you're building a sustainable business that can be profitable and is commercial and can run on its own. Otherwise, you're always dependent on other people to provide you with the funding needed to really drive the change that you're trying to drive.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thank you for that. Julie, kind of another question is around unintended consequences and kind of things you can't possibly think about in your business planning and your brainstorming, and any thoughts around that, any examples around that on how that may impact innovation and how you as an entrepreneur and in many of these cases, entrepreneurship, we're talking about the ability to be innovative in a larger company.
Well, this is such an interesting question because when you're trying to solve a problem, for example, when you're trying to create a self-driving car and your first mission is to get the human out of the car because that's the least safe element of the car itself, you don't think, okay, what other industries would I impact by doing that? So, for example, there was a show on 60 Minutes last night about the self-driving truck, and then the Teamsters are on there talking about they're going to get rid of all the drivers and lose all the jobs. So there's an unintended consequence of a self-driving truck, as an example. The other thing is that self-driving cars could upend the auto insurance industry, because if the cars are that safe, they can be self-insured, or they can be insured by the owner of the car itself, as opposed to the auto insurance industry. Nobody thinks about that when you're building a self-driving car. You're just worried about how do you keep from hitting the things on the road and hitting the cars in front of you. Another one that I sadly and horrifically participated in when I did a company called Perfect Market is we created a capability, and Google, you do this too, where we realized that if you were searching for something that you were interested in, then I could give you some more content that's just like what you just read that might be more interesting to you. So we were trying to keep, for publishers, more people on the site longer. So if you're reading a story about, say, a certain kind of retirement income, then I keep feeding you stories on retirement income. And what the unintended consequence is that you're only going to read what you like, and you're not going to get different viewpoints. And then that can have dire consequences in an election. So there's an unintended consequence. And so I guess what I would just say is that as you are part of an ecosystem that's building a radical new innovation, it's important to try to step back and say, okay, what could happen here? And is there any way to prevent it if it's bad, or encourage it if it's good?
David, a question for you from Alex, and we're fortunate. We've got audiences from young to old, different backgrounds, different career aspirations. And Alex writes, "What do you think about business school? Is it helpful if you want to go out and change the world and work at companies like this, or what are your thoughts about that, having been someone that's went to business school?"
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's a very personal question and depends on your situation. And I feel like people never like asking me these types of questions because my answer is always, it depends. It depends on your situation. The one advice I give everyone on my team that is thinking about going to business school is, most people are fairly competitive, like they want to win. The question that you should ask yourself is, for these 2 years, when you're putting your life on pause, right? Are you going to be comfortable with the fact that like you're going to see, blah, blah, blah from high school doing really well or whatnot? Because if the answer is yes, then that investment of time is worth the return. If the answer is, I don't love that, then I think that, that's probably not the right decision for you.
Great. And obviously, some of us has, some of haven't, some of us hired lots. And Julie, just your thoughts about that?
So I was working at Procter & Gamble when I got out of Tufts. And I remember I got, after 2 years, I got accepted to Harvard Business School. And I was on the factory floor working with a team. We were making laundry detergent, and Procter & Gamble was a really, really wonderful company with a wonderful team spirit. And I remember one of the workers in the soap factory took me aside and showed me the math about why it is not worth my while to go to business school, and it really, really stuck with me. But I can say, having had a long career, that the benefits outweighed the risks, or the benefits outweighed the negatives. And mostly because of not just getting a strong education, but it was getting exposure. At a school like Harvard, you do get exposure to people that are incredible, and your network is second to no one. So I always can pick up the phone and find somebody who can help me when I need to. So do not discount the network that is created by strong business schools, and it will serve you well. In point of fact, we just had a Zoom call for, I'm like 35 years out of business school, we had a Zoom call with my section just to see how everyone was doing in the pandemic. And that's how strongly some schools keep their alumni together. So I would recommend it if you want to really be an entrepreneur and you really need the kind of networking that a school like HBS gives you.
Super. Well, we're coming to the top of the hour. It's almost been an hour. That, again, we very much appreciate everybody's time. Let's the final question from Michael. We've talked about scaling. We've talked about minimal viable product, and we've got two incredible panelists that have seen this from the formation to the execution. But he asked, how important is forming the team, and how's the ideal team brought together? David, why don't we start with you on that one?
I think it's critically important. I think Julie's absolutely right that you invest in the entrepreneur and you invest in the team. I would say that I always tell people that the most important job, like all the managers that work for me, that you have is recruiting, right? You have to find kind of the right people that they're going to fit the culture. They're going to bring in a different perspective. I think that's also really important. You don't want to hire people just like yourself. And I think that anyone who's super busy, their natural reaction is going to be like, oh yeah, we'll take that person, because they're right there and they're a warm body and I need, someone to help me out with something. But when looking back at my personal failures in my career, I would say it's not taking the care to hire people who are smarter than you, who like to think differently than you, who are comfortable with failure, right? I think that is something that's a trait that's hard to find, and really taking the time to invest in finding a team person. So now, when I have an open role on my team, we'll go out and we'll look for 1,000 people before finding the right person. And that's almost the same way as we think about projects at X, because at X, it's almost I would say almost everyone. It's it's going to be that 1 in 1,000 type of person. That's how important it is to me.
All right, and Julie, last thoughts around that?
So a team is everything, and there's an alchemy to a team. And David talked about hiring someone smarter than you and someone who's different than you. Is you're really trying to put together a puzzle, and especially if you're running a startup, you're all about your constraints. So, sorry, David, you're never about constraints at Google, but in a startup,
we have constraints.
You are about your constraints. And when I look at a team that's failing, it's generally because, as I say, you have the tuba player trying to play the flute. What you really want to do is hire people who can do the job that they do naturally very well and have them do that job, but then have them integrate into the team. What I have seen is when I see teams failing, it's because they get political. They aren't all pulling in the same direction. They, generally one person, especially in a small team, especially small innovation team, can destroy the productivity of the rest of the team. So harmony on the team and the ability for the team to bring each other along is better sometimes than having one individual superstar. Although in the software world, we could probably get a debate going, but the best results I have seen is when you get this team dynamic where the team raises each other up and everybody performs at the highest level. Super.
Well, thank you very much. Fantastic to have you two superstars on our session today. Thank you very much. I know your time is incredibly valuable. Appreciated your insights and bringing that to the broader Tufts community. Would like to thank two other people, Amy McDonald, who manages the behind the scenes and makes sure everything goes great. Thank you very much, Amy. and Sue Purdy Pelosi, my wife, who's been manning the Q&As and helping out with some of the operations. So thanks very much to you two. Upcoming events, please keep in mind September 10th is a date that we'll have the next event, and we'll be sending out more information on that. And on September 21st, there will be a session entitled E-commerce Startups, What It Takes, Pitfalls and Lessons Learned, and that's on September 21st. So I think we just shared the Tufts Gordon Institute Entrepreneurial Alumni Network link, where some of those upcoming events will be promoted and information can be found. Thanks very much appreciated your time today. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you on some of the future sessions. Bye now.